and how to teach international humanitarian law. Obviously there are no absolute truths, but I think it's also a very good subject to train legal thinking, like all the distinctions and the fact that the reality doesn't fully fit with the rules is something we have in criminal law, in civil law, in social insurances and so on. And then on how to teach it, I'm obviously convinced that it's preferable to have interactive methods, to use cases and to provoke discussions with the students, even if from a humanitarian point of view I would like that everyone agrees on solutions. The reality in our world is that there are disagreements and there are different perspectives, and that students must understand the different perspectives which exist on many, but fortunately not on all IHL issues.
Well, I've been asked to talk about some of the challenges of teaching IHL but within a human rights course or an international relations course, and I thought I would explain some of the mistakes I've made over my time teaching.
Right, so I'm going to talk about teaching IHL in conflict situations and some of the challenges that may appear, the sensitivities, how do you deal with very strong identities and personal experiences, and really creating a safe place for students to evolve, to question what they know in order to really receive, to learn how to be critical about their surroundings and their realities.
In this session I want to show that teaching doesn't have to be dry, that the most important thing is for the teachers and the facilitators to always keep the learning in mind and structure their entire teaching with the aim that the student or the learner walks away with what the teacher wants them to walk away with. So when the course finishes, the student actually remembers what was in the course. And that requires a very diverse, interactive type of teaching, not just traditional lecturing. And this is something that can be done in any type of learning environment, whether it's a large university auditorium with 250 students, or whether it's a small adult workshop with 10 learners. Interactive teaching, team-based teaching can always be done. And it helps the memory and the experience to build that learning for the participants.
So we will start with Professor Sassoli with a few remarks on how to teach, why and how to teach IHL as a continuation from the discussion we just had in the previous session.
I have also worked in Anglo-Saxon universities. I would deconstruct the question, which is perhaps you don't have to teach put up an IHL course. Perhaps it's better to integrate IHL. For instance, in Pakistan, I had an interesting experience to have a public international law course, interstate law, and they have another public international law course, the individual in international law, and then they have human rights law, humanitarian law, refugee law, and so on. But let's now speak about IHL. Why teach IHL in any form? I think it is also interesting because we are more concerned, we here, not these people, we are more concerned about training lawyers, and I think IHL is not bad in training legal thinking, because there are all these distinctions and there are categories which do not fully correspond to reality, and this is what we have all the time. Think about private law, tort and contract. I mean, it doesn't correspond to reality, or what is a working contract, the untypical work and things like that. And this training to have rules which fall into categories like international armed conflict, non-international armed conflict, do not fit into the legal categories, but we have to work with the legal categories we have, is nothing specific of IHL. And here I, for instance, think it's better, IHL is better for legal training than human rights law, which is different. In the sense, you have to study the jurisprudence. It shows and it promotes justice. It is an extreme example of how public international law works. I have the impression that most of my students who are frustrated about the IHL simply did not understand what is international law. Some students will need it in their professional capacities, and I think as citizens it's always useful to have some idea. But how to teach? Well, as you know from the little text which is on the online casebook, and I hope you have read, I think it's important to link theory and practice. Students need both. Which should come first depends very much of the cultural background. In Geneva, they need first theory. In Canada, I always start with practice. This is simply a question of culture. But there are good reasons to give practice an important weight. Didactic reasons, because it's easier to memorize rules and distinctions if it is not in theory, but if it is taking the former Yugoslavia or Syria or whatever, then you better remember it. And in international law, obviously, practice is not just application, but also creates international law. I mean, the Tadic case is not so much a case study, but is a defining moment. And also to overcome the misconception that IHL does not work, to show that IHL offers realistic solutions. I think there are a lot of advantages of interactive teaching methods, but students don't like them because they look for security and certainty, and when it gets interactive, then there are different opinions. Case studies are, in my view, very useful, and they can be used in all teaching methods. You can also teach ex cathedra with case studies, so it's not linked to group work or whatever. They develop critical thinking, and I think that's important, that what counts is not the solutions, but good arguments. They accustom students to accept diverse opinions. Case studies simulate experience. The problem of students who finish their studies is never, in my experience, that their employer says they don't know enough about the law, but they have no experience. How can you get experience if you don't work first? Well, dealing with case studies, I tell my students, in your job interview, you can say, look, I already classified the situation in Guantanamo and tried to find arguments in favor of the detainees in Guantanamo. I already dealt with prisoners of war in Eritrea and Ethiopia. I already dealt with aerial bombardments in Sri Lanka, so I have experience. You can hire me. So, I am convinced that less substance but dealt with more in depth is preferable, while I know all of us must feel a little guilty, in particular when we see the Etienne looking at us, because obviously from the ICRC point of view it would be important that students get a full picture of IHL. But the problem is no one of us has enough time to deal with everything. Even in my Master in Advanced Studies course, I don't deal with judicial guarantees of prisoners of war. Simply, I don't deal with it. And when I have shorter courses, sometimes I fear I will not be accepted in the paradise of IHL when I didn't speak about the emblem, but one has to choose. And my mitigating circumstance, which I will say at the entry of paradise when they want to refuse me, I say, look, what counts is not how much I said, but how much the students understood. And if we go, but I see, I don't have to convince you. I only have to convince the few among us who are not teaching. Because if you teach, you know that simply telling the whole story, very little remains. While if you go in depth about one problem, and one day they become a commander of a prisoner of war camp, well, they know where the rules how to run a prisoner of war camp can be found, so I don't have to tell them how to run a prisoner of war.
Yeah, I guess, these all for teaching methodologies are great, and I think they are relevant to all the topics and courses. I wonder if there's something special that we can take for IHL courses especially.
I don't think method-wise there are differences. On the wider, between IHL and human rights law, I think there are methodological differences. It is wrong in IHL to mainly study court decisions, while you can teach human rights law through court decisions.
Thank you. And do you want to add a couple of words on whether IHL requires a specific methodology in your opinion?
Well, again, I think the case method is particularly appropriate for IHL because it happens in actual armed conflicts, and often there are no right answers and wrong answers.
My question is about methodology, about e-learning particularly. In countries like mine, Brazil, we are a big country, it might be a solution. So I would like to hear from you which are the main challenges in creating and teaching using e-learning platforms.
Because we already have some elements of answers to the first two questions, may I turn to you, Andrew, about the e-learning methodology? And I know that at the Graduate Institute, for instance, you use some e-learning platforms, including Moodle. If you have some elements on this.
Actually, the Academy set up a project to see if we could run an e-learning degree in IHL. We spent quite a lot of money and time and energy. And I have to report to you that the obstacles are much greater than you might imagine. It's really very, very hard to get this going. The technology is quite expensive and difficult. I mean, it sounds obvious. You just sort of log in and get some documents. Why would you need, like high-tech stuff? But it seems, I'm not an expert, but it seems that it's, in order to get interactive FaceTime with the professor, which would be what is expected, and to get a certain amount of professors to spend that amount of time with each of the individuals, or even to do the group learning where you sort of have multiple, group in a Skype, it's quite complicated, especially if you've got people around the world where the bandwidth is not necessarily going to be so easy. So I would say it's a great idea, but my experience is it's much harder than it looks, and you've got to have, for it to work, I'm told, a serious number of professor hours with the student through the medium. So obviously a great idea, but to be approached with caution. And you might ask Camelia to maybe share one of the reports that we commissioned here to see what the results were. But it was a huge amount out of my budget at the time on this that we spent, and the sort of conclusion that came back and from the sponsors as well is we can't go down that route. On the other hand, I think there are electronic or sort of high-tech routes that we can go that are quite successful. So you've mentioned something that is used, which I'm sure many of you have had access to, which is called Moodle, which is a platform which many universities use. And to answer your question, I have found it helpful, especially, as you suggest, for students who don't want to speak in English in public or need time to formulate their thoughts. So they would write to me or to the assistant through the Moodle, and one would be able to give reactions back. You can even do this in real time as you're teaching. I'm sure some of you have had experience of this. So that you have, not in this room, but in many classrooms, you'd have a sort of a podium, and then you have a big screen sort of in front of you. And you can have messages come in on the screen saying, well, I don't quite understand this point about proportionality. Do you mean this or this? And if you are a particularly good multitasker, you can teach and get back to the question, not necessarily responding to it, but you can sort of monitor the fact that you've lost some students. And as you say, they might be too shy to interrupt you, but you can sort of keep a track as you go or have an assistant do it. So that is one method. The other method, which I would recommend, and which hasn't been mentioned, which I'm sure many of you have got more experience than I have, is using clickers. Do any of you use clickers?
We do.
You do, yeah.
At the ICRC meeting.
So within a classroom, you distribute clickers to the students, and they can be sort of various degrees of sophistication, but it's a way of them voting on questions. And it's more sophisticated than maybe having a show of hands, one, because you've got the shyness, and two, you can be more sophisticated. So with regards to, I can't think of a good IHL example, but I remember we set up quite a complicated set of questions about belligerent reprisals, and whether belligerent reprisals against a particular cultural property or civilians outside of a Protocol 1 context ought to be considered legal under international law. And then, of course, you can have multiple responses. So instead of saying, who's in favour of reprisals, and half the hands go up, you can have, 4 options or 5 options. And so students are forced to choose as opposed to just follow what everybody else does when they put their hand up. And then on the screen comes up the results of your survey. And it's actually, to use your expression, a bit of an aha moment, because I remember when we did it on, I think it was on reprisals, that most of the class had voted in a way which certainly I and the assistant had not expected. And the people who had voted the other way, the minority, were totally shocked that the majority of the class had come down in that direction. And because it was anonymous, and because they had the question written down in front of them, and they had, you give them 2 or 3 minutes to decide how to press the button. It's not quite the same as asking for a show of hands. You get a much more sophisticated answer. And then you can say to people, why did you vote like that, the way you did? Whereas if somebody's put their hand up, then it's different, because they've chosen one of maybe 5 or 6 options, and they've had to think it through. So I would recommend the clickers. It takes a bit of getting used to, but certainly in the feedback I got from the students, they enjoyed it. And it doesn't have to take a lot of time. It can be like just 5 minutes. And sometimes I would warn them. I would say at the end of class, as you say, as they're going out, you want them to be thinking, next time there are going to be these 5 questions, and you're going to have to choose. And we're going to click in the first 5 minutes, and then we're going to look at the results. And it actually works rather well. And that, again, especially for people who you're not going to get to participate, but who need a bit of time to look at the answer.
On e-learning, just one idea, because I confirm, unfortunately, it needs a lot of manpower, because you cannot simply say, we put that online and then... but I think a lot can be done through e-learning, and at least my feeling is that we all waste a lot of time in things where they don't need a professor. I mean, they don't need a professor to tell them a story or to tell them a theory. This can be done through e-learning, and we can concentrate. And at the University of Geneva, we have such a diploma on human rights, which goes for 1 year, and there are only 2 weeks in Geneva. And there, ideally, but unfortunately the professors don't always comply, there is no lecture at all. But the pure interaction, because this is very difficult to make.
I'd like to turn to both Marco and Olivier and bring back the question that was asked in the previous session on, if I'm remembering correctly, on how to ensure that the teaching is really linked to practice, as really what are the means to have a really practice-oriented teaching methodology. And I have to say, this is something that we really promote at the ICRC. This is why we have so many tools as well that are based on case studies. And I think both Marco and Olivier, you have some good recommendations maybe to share with us on including practice and concrete examples.
sorry, I'm as boring as a priest. My solution is always cases out of the online cases. But obviously, now that there are so many there, there's a question of which ones to choose. There are some which are more harmless and some are really battle issues. But yes, I'm convinced that one has to make the link with practice, but also the other way around. I mean, I think one also has to link practice to theory, to explain students that this is not only a case of this lady who unfortunately and so on, but behind it there are, and I fully agree with Andrew, there are fundamental questions of international law, how it works today, and that somehow in international investment protection law there are very similar problems.
And now I think a lot of you are teaching IHL not necessarily as standalone courses, but integrated within other courses. So my turn to you, Professor Clapham, as someone with a lot of experience in teaching IHL in other courses. What are your recommendations, especially for courses on human rights, for instance, or international relations, how you would include IHL?
Well, thank you. It's nice to see you all again. I thought I would tell you three things that I used to do in teaching a bit of IHL within human rights, and which I no longer do because I think they're wrong. So when I first arrived here in Geneva, there was a lot in the press about it being the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we're talking 1998. And of course, in those days, you couldn't get on TV, and there was sort of internet didn't really have the same kind of reach. And so my students and I were reading things like the Tribune de Genève, which I don't know if any of you come across anymore, but there was a very nice sort of timeline about the history of human rights. And it started with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in Geneva, of course, and then there was Henri Dunant, and his moment in Geneva, of course, and then it went through to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, drafted in Geneva, and the Geneva Conventions in 1948-49, drafted again in Geneva, a very Geneva-focused thing. But I rather like this timeline because I thought for teaching purposes, it showed a sort of continuity and the students could relate to it and so on. And I was going through my papers the other day and I found the original thing. And now I rather think it's wrong to present this as one long continuum of progress in history, and that somehow human rights and IHL are just sort of stages along the way. I think in teaching human rights, I've come to sort of say, actually, no, the history of human rights has its own trajectory. And even if they were drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and they were drafting the Geneva Conventions in the same city in the same year in 1948, those of you who are familiar with this will know Robert Kolb has written a very good piece of research which shows that they didn't actually talk to each other at all. Or if they did, it's the exception. And we're still living, Marco and I live this a lot, all the time, of sort of two different groups, the human rights groups and the IHL types, who, of course, meet from time to time, like today, but the way in which the law develops and the way in which things progress are not necessarily all interconnected and part of some march towards history. So I've sort of stopped that, and then probably I exaggerate a little in the other direction to say these are two completely different routes, and they don't really have the same aim. Just while I'm on the history, I don't know, has anybody told you a bit about this room? Did you have a talk about where we are in Villa-Moignet? So just because it is part of the sort of historical approach to this. This was Gustave Moignet's home, obviously one of the founders of the ICRC. And because I did a little bit of research on this topic, this was his living room, and about where Professor Sassoli is sitting now is the desk where he wrote the first Geneva Convention. So we are, in the presence of history here with Gustave Moignet. Why not? So he, of course, was the drafter of that as the lawyer. Even if Dunant, took a lot more of the credit. But the point is that I don't think you can sort of link all this up as one single route, especially if you're trying to teach the law of human rights and the law of international humanitarian law. So again, there was a temptation, certainly when I first started teaching, reading the textbooks and talking to students, to sort of say, well, of course, the focus on the individual starts through Nuremberg and the prosecution of war crimes, and that's the emergence of the international on the world stage. And then we have the individual as a bearer of human rights, and it's all connected up. And both IHL and human rights are about the dignity of the individual. But again, I've stopped doing that. I think it's misleading. I think it's better to give, as Professor Sassoli suggests, give the students the tools to try to unravel how IHL works. And as you all know, IHL is not really about the protection of the individual most of the time. A lot of it is about other things which are entitling states to target certain military objectives or whatever. But the individual is not the focus of that discussion. So I have moved away from suggesting that these are pulling in the same direction, and I suppose I go more into, when I'm teaching human rights, trying to show that actually there may be a tension here, and of course that's what the students begin to find interesting. So these days it would be impossible to teach a human rights class without talking about drones and targeted killing and counter-terrorism. And at that point, you have to explain how something could be legal under IHL and perhaps illegal under human rights. And to try to show that the fact that something is not prohibited under one branch of law might not necessarily lead to the conclusion that it's legal under the other branch. And as many of you know now, this is an interesting area. It depends whether you think international law is permissive and allows you to do things, or whether it's just a set of prohibitions. But I think that's a more honest way into the topic with students. And we had the discussion yesterday about detention in international and non-international armed conflict. Again, you can't teach human rights law and the Hassan case, for example, which we discussed yesterday, without also giving them an introduction to what international humanitarian law might entitle you to do. So, to be frank, rather than stressing this as one harmonious march towards human progress and the protection of the individual, I tend to focus these days on the tensions. And the fact that there are two worlds. Françoise Hampson has an interesting expression which she's used to say, these days it's important to stress that there are very few people who might be what she calls bilingual. And by that she means able to discuss an international humanitarian law problem with the same authority that they could address a human rights problem. And I think that, I used to teach bilingually at the Institute when all students had to speak English and French and all classes were in both languages. But I think in teaching human rights, I would sort of stress to them that it's not enough to think that international humanitarian law is for times of armed conflict and human rights is for times of armed peace, and I only need to know one and be specialised in the one. Because inevitably, there will be times when they need to know both. I'll finish with an example maybe of why somebody learning human rights might need to know IHL even in times of peace. The obvious example being a question of universal jurisdiction arises either for the prosecution of a war crime in non-international or grave breach in international armed conflict. And you would have to be able to understand that to pursue that individual before national courts, even in Switzerland, which, thanks to Marco and the work of trial, I mean, people do get prosecuted in Switzerland, which of course is a country not in armed conflict, for crimes committed in other countries, war crimes. And therefore trying to teach a student who's interested in these things, and they will inevitably be interested in prosecuting those who have violated international criminal law, you have to give them both pictures. And that has been a bit my approach.
Professor Klapper, if you can elaborate in the relationship with international relations that you were about to talk about, that I think is very interesting.
I'll use the same methodology that I used before to say that I got this wrong when I first started teaching, and I'll tell you what went wrong. I assumed that these international relations students needed to be told what the law was, and that if I talk about, for example, proportionality, it has a meaning. And that's really the only meaning that they should be interested in, because it's a law class for international relations, and if they get it wrong, they're not going to pass. And of course, I've realised now that that is not necessarily the way to go, because there may be their understanding of proportionality within international relations, which is closer to what is actually going on in the world than what I am talking about. And after they leave the classroom, I like your expression that they should take what I've presented to them and relate it back to what they're doing and sort of have an aha moment, but continue with what they need it for. And so I realized that international relations students who were interested in proportionality in the context of an armed conflict, because just war theory teaches them that it's somehow all wrapped up in the jus ad bellum, the civilians and the proportionality and all the rest of it, it's no good me saying, look, that's a separate branch, you're going to do that with Marco Sassoli next week, we're only talking about this kind of proportionality. I had to meet them halfway. I had to say, look, when your colleagues talk about proportionality, when you are reading about it, when you're writing about it, this is what's going on. And when we're talking about it, this is what's going on. And sometimes there will be a mixture. And I sort of adjusted my sort of rigid approach to, as I say, meet them. I'll give you one other example, it's a pretty obvious one for this audience. I've been teaching war, obviously laws of war, but war as a concept to international relations students. And of course I can tell them what war is for an international lawyer, but they are working with these projects out of Sweden which defines war in a completely different way. And if I sort of ignore that and say, well, your definition of war is wrong and mine is right, and I'm going to talk only about my definition, it's useless for them, because when they go on to do their postdoctoral studies in war and conflict and civil war and all the rest of it, they need to know what everybody else is talking about and how that might be legitimate, even if not legally correct in other contexts, and how to be flexible and work with it. So I've adjusted my approach to them, and I think that's important if you're teaching international relations, because they're not going to be international lawyers when they leave your class. They're going to go back as political scientists or an advisor to a prime minister and so on. And I think, as I tried to say, and I'm glad you picked it up, that if you give them the tools to know that when Sir Michael Wood is talking about war, he means one thing, and when the president of North Korea is talking about it, he might mean something else. And to be able to distinguish what's going on, rather than saying you're right, you're wrong, then you win over your international relations students.
Another question we wanted to address this afternoon, also knowing that quite a few of you in this room come from a context where there is an armed conflict ongoing, or where the situation is politically tensed or really heavy in terms of emotionally heavy. We also wanted to ask you, Yael, how you teach IHL in a context where there's such a heaviness in terms of political emotion, let's say.
Okay. Thank you, Anne, and thank you, everyone. It's wonderful to share these experiences and to hear from you and to see all of you here. So, yes, politically tense situations, that's where I come in. I'm the director of the International Criminal and Humanitarian Law Clinic. We've had a chance to present with the other clinic directors that were here the difference or uniqueness, not said negatively or positively, is that my clinic operates in a protracted conflict, intergenerational conflict. We have punctual wars once in a while, but this is a continuous situation, and this has repercussions as to teaching international humanitarian law and related areas. So when this question was presented to me, I was thinking, how could I present the complexity or give you the most of it? So maybe I can, with the short time that we have, a few minutes, touch on the objectives, some of the challenges, and maybe the nature. I'd like to also perhaps speak especially to those who come from conflict situations. Every case is very specific. But for those of you who teach outside these conflict zones, then perhaps I can relate to what Professor Sassoli has said before, when you have one student from Palestine or one student from Israel or one student from Sri Lanka, or one student from Syria. So in our situation, in our clinic, everyone is from this one situation. So you can imagine the variety, the diversity, how interesting and challenging it is for me, and gratifying also for me personally to be able to teach these people, and some of them have a lot of experience, more than me or different than me, and then I can also learn, etc. I also walk into the beginning of the year. That's actually the year is going to begin, the academic year in less than a month, in a few weeks. And so I walk in with one idea, and I might end up, I don't know how I'll walk out. I know how I walk in. The objective, my personal objective in founding this clinic, in running it, is mainly almost never to tell my students what to think. I never want to do that, but I want to make them think. I want to make them challenge their ideas, because they come into the classroom with a lot of ideas and a lot of preconceptions, personal experiences, and I want to make them be critical about what they think. I don't tell them what to think. They can think left, right, it doesn't matter to me. So I want to give them the tools to think, to go beyond the political discourse, to go beyond what they read in the media and hear on TV, and to really to go through some kind of sincere and genuine process, and to understand that it's a process. So what we do in the clinic is, first of all, it's a course, like how. There's a course in international criminal law with specialization in international humanitarian law, and a new branch, transitional justice. So this all relates, because for me, I don't see really borders. So you need to know these laws, and they're going to be applicable, especially if you're living in a conflict zone. You need to know everything, because we start with the problem. If you said you can teach through the problem, we have all these problems, and then how do you treat them? And you need different tools, and you need to understand the difference between these different tools. So we have a course. In order to make the course more alive, there's a moot court also, and it's the question. It's internal to the clinic, and it's internal. It's divided throughout the syllabus, like the questions, and of course we keep to practice, etc. But beyond the course, students participate in practical. They receive practical experience, because it's a clinic. It's a law clinic. So that's the advantage. And the idea is to expose them to the widest range of practitioners, so the widest things they can do in this field. And for me, there's no real taboo. There's no one, or I can't imagine someone that I would say you can't come to the clinic, or we choose our projects with international organizations, international criminal tribunals, government actors, NGOs, civil society, individual attorneys, possibly victims. It's one of our objectives growing into transitional justice. But to bring people on and to expose them to the students, there's almost no one I can imagine to say, no, you can't enter here. There's no banning, there's no boycotts, there's no taboos. There are core rules, and this is for my students as well, core rules of you can say what you think, but you have to do it respectfully, of course, and you have to base it in law.
May I just make one remark on what you said, because it also came up in a conflict area and so on. I admire what you do. Unfortunately, my experience is it doesn't work everywhere. A reserve possibility, which I experience can work, is to have a case from somewhere totally else. So it depends very much, but ideally one should do what you do, because as you know, I think IHL is about here and now, about your enemies, but in my experience, sometimes the conflict is so deeply felt that at least I have not been able to take the conflict, but a faraway conflict, and the message is then often the same, and at least intelligent people, they immediately made the link. But it didn't lead to polemics.
Professor Bias, when you teach international humanitarian law in a context of conflict, it's very important to use the course, I don't know if you agree with me, to use the course as a forum for dialogue, and in that sense, possibly reconciliation or understanding at least the other parts. Do you believe, and what will be the best strategy for achieving that in those scenarios? To use the course, to use the forum of the class in a way that you will allow students to express themselves, learn about the other, and in that sense be like a seabed for reconciliation.
Yeah, do you think that your class can be used as a forum for reconciliation?
Well, thank you for this question. I think reconciliation is a big word, and it's very ambitious. I think there's so many steps that we need to do before that. and especially when you're inside the conflict zone and when your students are from a not varied enough background, but a lot of personal experience, let's say. They come with a lot of baggage. So the first challenge is really to create a safe place, and I think Olivier mentioned that. A safe place not only for education, but especially in a conflict zone. And a safe place means, in a conflict zone, in a sensitive place, it means that people are listening to the smallest terminology that you are using to see, and they're waiting to categorize you, and did you use this term or this term? And it's really the objective is to build a safe place, a place that is credible. The fact that it's non-political, non-partisan, that's something you need to own. You can't just say that. And it's a continued process, I think, and I hope we'll continue to be doing this. This is one of my hopes for the future for this clinic, is that it will continue doing what it does, to create this credible and safe place where people who are affected by conflict personally, directly, either in their personal lives or professional lives or whatever, in their different capacities, and they can really go through a process. Reconciliation is also a process, but maybe what we're doing is the ground, is setting the stones for this future thing. Because one of the main methods that I apply is to make my students think about their conflict by learning from other conflicts. Because then they have this step backwards, and then afterwards come back and apply it. Is this relevant? How would this be relevant to our conflict?
I teach a standalone course on IHL in University of Colombo, Sri Lanka. But since the end of the conflict in 2009, there is lesser interest on the part of the students to register for the course because it's also optional. And there seems to be more interest in studying transitional justice or human rights as opposed to IHL. So in such a context, my question is, how do you promote the IHL course and allow more students to have an understanding of IHL? Thank you.
I come from Peru. Similar discussions about reconciliation as with Colombia back there. Similar context, but Peru is in its, 20th year of reconciliation process post-conflict. And so, despite that, not many courses about IHL have been opening. There are some few here and there, but it's not something that you would say, how many courses are there? And so I've been bugging my university for 3 years, telling them, let's open a course, and they finally said yes, and they gave me this question that made me think a lot. Do you want to make it an elective or a mandatory course? And I'm not sure I have the answer, because of course, if you enroll in the Geneva Academy, you have an interest in IHL, you are willing to question some things, or maybe you even know already a lot about it. But especially in countries like Peru, like Colombia, Israel, so much of so many people's lives and identities are based on the idea that no, there was no armed conflict, and international humanitarian law is this thing that the communists used to, and it's their identity, it's what they believe. So if I make it an elective, I risk not having enough students and not opening the course. If I make it mandatory, I will get these people that will come with very personal stories of, we cannot accept that this is an armed conflict. And how can they pass the courses? So my dilemma here is, first of all, if you have any thoughts on, I don't know how it works in other conflict countries, but is it better to make it voluntary, elective, or mandatory? And if, depending on the option, if the strategy changes, I like the idea of the safe place, the polemics, but what do you do with these people that have their very own identity, military families, long-standing military families that simply will reject it from the start?
Maybe we can merge somehow the first two questions on how to, on one hand, get students interested, and especially in some areas where you get the feeling that IHL, there's less and less interest, and at the same time that discussion on elective versus compulsory courses and whether that has an impact. Actually, you're making my job difficult because I know all of you can answer those questions. Anyone wants to take that?
Before I answer, just to say, when we say we study other conflicts, we study Sri Lanka, we study Colombia, we study Peru. I take students and we try and put this in practice, so they have to be think tanks for the UN, and they have to write a memo on different conflicts. Each group works on one conflict, they have to study it, what mechanisms were there, and then they have to tell the UN Secretary General, UNSG, this is what you should do, this is what mechanisms you should promote, so it's legal, but how it affects conflicts. I wish I had, you're in a good place. I wish I had this problem, but I think the way to realize, if everyone is interested in transitional justice, then personally, I would say, what is transitional justice? It's understanding how we want to treat past injustices. We can call it violations, we can call it grave breaches. That's IHL. So how we want to deal with these injustices in order to look forward, towards the future. So if you want to do that, you can start in the middle. The middle, let's say, learning about the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, for former Yugoslavia. And you can see, one of its specializations, its expertise, was case law on war crimes, on IHL. What's NIAC, etc. And what were or are the effects of this tribunal, very special tribunal, on the conflict in the Balkans? And so this could maybe help students who are your future generations take part in the decisions of what your country should do. Should it go to the criminal procedure? What are the effects? And you should learn about this. And if it's a criminal procedure, is it international? Is it domestic? About you, sir, people coming with very strong opinions and very strong identities. This is something I have experience with in the class. I think it's a tone that you set from the start. And that in every rule that you do, you have to do it candidly. You have to be 100% with it. And I make everyone understand that I'm very respectful and I'm very appreciative of their emotions, of their past, of their personal experience, of their traditions, of their beliefs and their identities. If they believe that this conflict cannot be an international conflict, that's fine. But justify it legally. You're in a law course. So you have to justify it legally. And also, I would make them think, why are they holding on to this stance so fervently? Why is it so important to them? What are the consequences of choosing this? We're in a classroom. We can imagine, we can get out of it. Outside, you can say, this is not IAC, okay. But in this classroom, let's try and explore what the consequences, legal consequences, and maybe societal consequences of saying it's a non-international armed conflict. Okay, this means 1, 2, 3. We will try people for combating or not trying people for combating. We will stigmatize them, terrorists or not. Or we would say this is international armed conflict, maybe, and then they're either combatants or non-combatants, but they're either criminals or non-criminals, depending on the methods, the means, not the ends. So, tell them just try and be less, try and be younger. Your students, I think, are younger than you. Just tell them you're younger than me, be a bit more explorative. Let's just think together. Nothing will happen if you explore. And afterwards you can leave this class with your opinions. It's fine.
I'm going to take the opportunity to answer the Peru, Colombia, Sri Lanka issue. There's a nice coincidence here, but one of the issues that some of you may be following is that, of course, there is a Sri Lankan who may be prosecuted in Colombia under universal jurisdiction. And I think that if you're asking, how does one approach teaching this in Colombia or Peru when people don't necessarily want to talk about the laws of armed conflict as they apply in Peru or in Colombia, is to start to talk about this in terms of global justice, that there could be to flip the example, a Sri Lankan who comes through Colombia or a Colombian who comes through Sri Lanka. And students ought to be interested in issues of global justice as to how you would prosecute that. So without reopening up the whole question as to what was the armed conflict in Sri Lanka all about, you can, as has been suggested, talk about the conflict in Colombia with a view to seeing whether Sri Lankan law would allow for such prosecution. And I just sort of jotted it down that instead of thinking about this only, and it sort of comes back to the other thing you asked me to talk about, only as a question of IHL, it's a way, for example, in Peru, Sri Lanka or Colombia, to teach about the relationship between national law and international law. To what extent are these international crimes prosecutable at the national level? It's a way to talk about the international law of jurisdiction or the international law of immunity or the international law of non-intervention. Can Sri Lanka complain that Colombia is doing this? Is that a sovereign right that's being violated? And so instead of maybe spinning the class as, maybe the ICRC is not going to thank me for this, an IHL class, maybe it's a class about international law and questions of armed conflict. And then it becomes more justifiable as compulsory, and also you would attract people who might be interested in questions which are, more useful day to day afterwards. The relationship between international and national law through an IHL prism could be a great way to just teach that topic.
Now, I have a question to you. It's a genuine question. Because ideologically, I fully agree with what you say. But where's the limit? And it was not in a conflict area. It was in Montreal after September 11. There was a student who brought the famous conspiracy theory you must be familiar with, that all the Jews were evacuated before them. And then I thought, I cannot react as you suggest, but I said, look, if it is on facts, because on law you may have all opinions possible, but on facts, simply to say, I'm not an expert on facts, and obviously if you are right, then it's a crime against humanity, and so on. I felt that somewhere, as an IHL professor, I also have a responsibility to say, this is wrong, and I can't accept this. Because otherwise, somehow, why do we teach? Everything is possible. Why should not someone say the Holocaust never happened, but all on the contrary, and so on, or the genocide in Rwanda, and so on? But how do you deal with such things while remaining not authoritative and say, now I'm the boss, and I tell you, in this class, we don't discuss this case?
Thank you for the question. I think there is a limit also for what you accept. The answer, the how do you react, it depends on the situation. It's not a one. But I would say, this is like a court of law, this classroom, okay? So your evidence right now on conspiracy would be rejected. It has no value here, conspiracy. I don't listen to conspiracy. Talk to me in something else. If you want to convince me, the example you gave, sir, is different. It's a position, of course. Absolutely. But I do agree with you that I believe there is a limit to, freedom of speech. And legally, there's also a limit to freedom of speech. So I didn't invent the wheel. But, in your example, your student will become your best student. If you tell him, maybe you're right, convince me, he'll become your best student,
In my experience, and the question came earlier about the cross-cultural or the intercultural dimension in different teaching methods, it's something we can come back to. I've had to work with either both professors and students who were extremely opinionated about certain things. And to try to loosen those opinions, the only way possible was to remind them and help them in allowing discussion to happen. And very often it is at the cost of the content of a course as it is described in the syllabus. Very often I've had to tell professors, well, if you're having this problem and it is really hampering the learning, then you need to take half a class out and say, for half the class we're going to do something completely different. We're going to try to find a common space where we can have a conversation that is constructive and where everyone feels included, and then continue with the content of the course. The most damaging is to to forge ahead on the content because you believe you must cover it all in that course. You can't finish the course without everything. And actually, the students learn very little and have a terrible memory of the course because they were not listened to, they felt marginalized, they felt that only the strong voices got to speak up, and they felt that the majority of the class was simply not respected. Then you've actually lost the entire course. I'll end with that.
And to finish, we've also asked Olivier to join us again as an expert on teaching methodologies for adults. If you can give us a few ideas, maybe, on how to teach to student audiences.
Listening to the previous three speakers, I hear some parallels in your interests and in your passion to help students learn, to facilitate learning. I work in an environment today where I encourage and promote learning in leadership and decision-making skills for managerial staff in the ICRC. Previously, I worked at business schools developing courses just like you are teaching, but in other disciplines, mostly in leadership managerial skills. But what I always had a passion for is helping the professors to teach in such a way that when the course finishes, the student leaves the classroom on that very last day and says, I remember at least these three things, and these will help me onwards. And because I often acted as academic advisor to students, I often asked them, so what are you learning? And when I see a blank face, I made sure I would meet that professor and ask the professor, can I help you in any way to enhance your teaching? I can let you watch another teacher doing a great job in facilitating learning in one way or another. And it always comes back to the same questions and the same passions in teaching that I hear from you three, which is interactive teaching methods from Marco. Students look for security. You're absolutely right. Students need security because otherwise they will not open up and ask the daring questions. Nobody wants to look stupid, in class especially. So you need to create an environment where students dare to ask the stupid questions and not feel laughed at. And Andrew give students the tools to discover. And then Yael spoke of never tell students what to think, but help them to be critical about what they know. And this is so important, whether you teach, and I said that on Monday, whether you teach 18-year-olds that have never yet studied, Introduction to International Law 100, or whether you teach adults who are already working professionals. You must always begin by a sign of respect, by helping all of the learners realize that they are here not just to learn, but they are here with valuable knowledge that they can share. And so safety in a learning environment is really a space where everyone can dare to share what they already bring. Even if they are just 18 years old and they're for the very first time at a university class and they're nervous as hell. So how do you do that? There are various ways of doing that. The opening on Monday morning was one way, is to have a bit of fun, but at the same time have something instructional that will allow everyone to relax and get to know each other and get to exchange with each other. Another way is to encourage to use different methods of teaching. So there are basically 4 methods of teaching, and you all practice them all, I'm sure. But the most common one is the magisterial. You're talking in front, and the students are pretty passive, right? They can almost fall asleep if you talk for more than 15 minutes. They don't need to do anything, because most of them know there's an exam at the end and they'll cram for it anyway. The second method is interrogative. You ask them, you get responses, you give great examples, you make them interact with you the teacher or the professor or the facilitator. If it's an adult workshop, you won't be a teacher. You'll be facilitating the learning in a circle, perhaps. But it's the same interaction is happening. But then you have a demonstrative way of teaching. And that is where you get the students to actually watch how something is done. You may give the example, or you may assign a group of students an assignment to show the example in next week's class. How do you do this? How do you discuss it? How do you explain it? How do you present it visually? That becomes a learning experience for those who are watching, and then they have to emulate. So that's learning through demonstration. And then the fourth way of learning is the aha experience, right? It's the discovery. As you were saying, you have to help students discover that with their own thinking skills, which they come with into your class, they can actually learn to think even more critically. They can learn to think within the frame of certain legal context that you are teaching. But they can then link what they know, what they believe they know, and what they're learning in your class. And that's how learning happens, isn't it? We all learn by associating what you already know, and you compare and contrast it with new information. That's how we learn. That's what you're doing. So there are different ways, different techniques of teaching. After these four methods, there are a zillion techniques of teaching, and there are even more tools to teach. This is just a tool, right? A whiteboard, or an app on a mobile phone. You can have great teaching when all the students have a smartphone and you have Wi-Fi, and you can ask them questions on your overhead projector, and competitively in teams they start answering on the mobile phones yes or no. And then you'll see on the screen which team is winning. So instead of having simply a multiple choice that everyone does on their own, or instead of having simply lectures and then a final exam, you can actually have interactive, semi-competitive learning in the classroom that is actually borders onto fun. But what happens when these students go home after class? That's the moment they will remember. Those are the answers to the questions they will remember the next day. A method of teaching, I should say a technique of teaching, that is very effective is what is often referred to as the upside-down class. And I'll finish very quickly. It's the upside-down class. You get students to read before class, and then you have quizzes in class, and then you have group work with them together so that they can actually show to each other what they remember from the reading and how that builds on a lecture that you might give. So it's a building on the reading and on the lecture. That's called team-based learning. And I'm happy to talk more about it, but in the USB keys you have received on Monday, there is a document in there that explains it and gives you further links to look at team-based learning. It works for huge auditoriums, yes, and it works for small groups.
Thank you very much. I think we'll end here, and thank you to the four of you for taking the time to join us again. Thanks.
I don't think IHL is a very special case. There is a general challenge today that many universities have still lectures, which I think is a waste of resources, because students could learn this either electronically or through books, and that one should much more put emphasis on interaction. Based on what one already studied. And obviously there was the question of e-learning, which sounds wonderful with all these MOOCs, but it has to be very well organized to be efficient. And then there was the issue of a lack of interest in IHL, and there I wouldn't oblige people to study IHL if they don't want to study IHL course. But it is part of public international law. And I mean, I cannot simply because someone doesn't like the law of the sea not to speak about the law of the sea. So we have to mention also IHL in a public international law course. And those who are interested, they can take an optional course. And I also think it is important to make the link with human rights law and refugee law, because there are common things and things to be distinguished. And therefore, everyone teaching human rights law should also speak a little about the IHL and vice versa.
Well, I think one of the things that came out in the panel is that not all students in all universities are going to have a class on IHL. So often it's going to be part of another class. And then you haven't got the luxury of saying, oh, we've got a bit of IHL here, you're going to have to study that with somebody else. You're going to have to explain the basics of IHL in order to explain universal jurisdiction or a drone attack or whatever it is. And that's tough to encapsulate all the rules of IHL within another course, but it has to be done.
I find it very gratifying to teach IHL, especially where I teach it in Israel, to students of law in Israel, so not only Israelis. For me, a success story is to get a student thinking, to get students engaged with each other and to accept different positions, and to base them legally. So really, if I see that they have sort of gained maturity in their positions, some of them have also changed or nuanced positions. So yeah, discovering that it's a live field. It's not a dead letter. So. Yeah.
IHL, like any teaching of law, has the great advantage of already using case studies. Case studies is a new thing in many other disciplines. In law, it's already well built in, and a case study is very malleable. The way you use a case study can be done as a test, a quiz, it can be done as a game, it can be done competitively, it can be done as team projects, individual projects. There are many different ways of using case studies. So actually, a professor who teaches international law or IHL has a huge advantage over most other disciplines. So it's just a way of using the case studies more creatively.